probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
I tell you what, I don't think there was a more accurate state. And
if they struggle again, I don't think there's any way you can keep Alex Grinch. But
what's going on, y'all? I'm Bud Elliot. That's Cody Goodwin of Bama 247. It's Bama Day on Summer School. Cody, welcome back to the show, man.
No, this is actually, I think, my first appearance, man. Like,
okay.
You had Talty on last year, and so this year, I guess I got the call up. So welcome to the show, right?
That's right. Now, I do believe Cody came to our Cover 3 listener meetup in Nashville, which was not heavily attended because of a literal tornado warning. So, but the real ones came. Not that we encourage you to do that during a tornado, of course. Slow off season at Bama. Not much going on really since the end of the season.
We really got a lot of time to cover the basketball team's Final Four run, man. There really wasn't a whole lot of anything going on, football wise.
Okay, that game against Grand Canyon.
The first weekend.
That set the sport back like 100 years. It was exciting because it was close, but I was like, oh my God, this is wild.
Like, it's funny because they played Grand Canyon, but like proverbial rock fight in the form of a basketball game. Like, it was bad. Like, it was so bad. I didn't think that team was getting through UNC, but Nate Oates is a little bit of a magician, it seems.
I'm not a huge college basketball guy, and then I looked and I was like, okay, where the hell does some of these Grand Canyon kids come from? Like, I started Googling. It's like, oh, okay, he was like the number one rated JUCO guy, and then he got sick. He went to Kansas, and athletically, they look like they belong. Now, shooting wise, maybe some of the skill part, not so much, but like athletically, they ran with Bama and banged with Bama for a long time. It's like, okay, this is interesting. I never really heard of Grand Canyon. So
yeah, Grand Canyon, sneaky good athletic programs. They had a softball team. In the NCAA, we're following the NCAA softball stuff now too. They had a game. I think it was against UCLA. So they were, they ended up losing, but hey, they got to the final 32, right?
Okay. That I will take your word for it. I don't really follow college softball that much until like the final couple series. So Nick Saban decides to retire, and Alabama hires Kalen, Deboer. Fan base reaction, your first impressions of Deboer and his staff, just wherever you want to take that, open-ended for you.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think the fan base has been like cautiously optimistic, right? And I think the more that they've gotten to know him and they've gotten to know, him being Deboer, they've gotten to know his track record, what he's known for, right? The X's and O's, the play calling, getting the most out of what he's got in front of him on the roster. They're really coming around to him. Deboer himself seems a little bit more like polar opposite of Saban, right? Like everything Saban said, people were on the edge of their seats. It, could have huge implications on like what, what's the state of college football? Like Saban was kind of that elder statesman. Deboer's just kind of a dude. Like he's just kind of like he's a dad that loves to golf and, also happens to be one of the sport's best play callers. So a little bit boring on that end. But I think I personally like the hire. I think there was a lot of people, maybe in our circles that thought, Dan Lanning was kind of the perfect slide him in, right? Like defense first guy. He's got history at Bama. He could kind of keep the train on the tracks. And so when Deboer comes in, you start thinking about it a little bit more, and it's like, okay, this guy has won everywhere he's been. Clearly put on a masterclass over the last 2 years at Washington, especially this past year, getting the Huskies to the national championship game. And you kind of look at where college football is headed, right? With the prevalence of the transfer portal, NIL, recruiting and just the way that talent is kind of, matriculating across all the country, right? Like it's kind of, there's a lot more parity now, right? And we saw a lot of that this year. So how do you differentiate yourself if there's a lot of parity there? You go get an expert play caller, right? And I think that's more or less what Greg Byrne was trying to get with Kalen Deboer. Which makes Alabama's always interesting, right? But it makes them so much more intriguing this upcoming season because now you've got a guy who's a master play caller. He's always done more with less, and now he's got the most talented roster he's ever had. So, 2024 Alabama is going to be very, very intriguing from both a local and national perspective for many, many reasons.
We'll start on the offense here. Has he said that Jalen Milroe is like the guy for sure? And if so, how do we expect this offense to look? I know when I was digging into Deboer's background, he's actually had a quarterback be the leading rusher or the second leading rusher. And like, I'm talking like 1,000-yard, rushing seasons, like 3 times in the last 15 years as a head coach or play caller. How do you expect this offense to look? Because they also lost Ryan Grubb and the O-line coach both decided to take it on to the NFL.
Yeah, those are two sneaky big losses, right? Because, Ryan Grubb, has been Deboer's offensive coordinator, right? He was there at Fresno. He was there again at Washington. He was going to come down to Alabama until the Seahawks job came open. He decided to stay up in Washington. Offensive line guy by trade, right? So then you have him, you have Scott Huff as well. Kalen Deboer's got history working with offensive lines too. So you still have a little bit of that, but 3 minds are better than one, right? If you can get it, especially if those guys with that track record that they've got. So Jalen Milroe, so far as we know, is the guy going into the summer. Probably going to be the guy to open fall camp. So quarterback's an interesting conversation in Tuscaloosa, man, because that's, on one hand, you've got Jalen Milroe, who I think surprised a lot of people. He was good, not great. He had some great moments. He also had some moments that left you shaking your head. I think he was more or less the quarterback that they chose last year because the offensive line had so many issues. And so he kind of gave them the best chance to make the most out of the situation that they had, right? And he was good. He was very good sometimes. So now you bring in Kalen Deboer, who routinely gets the most out of his quarterbacks. He's got a great track record of quarterback production, right? Jake Haener, Michael Penix Jr. Now you've got Jalen Milroe, who's got a lot of fun, toolsy stuff, right? So on one hand, what can Deboer do with Jalen Milroe? On the other hand, you look at the offense that he runs, right? Still the same offense that he ran at Fresno and Washington. It's that, spread offense with some pro concepts. There's a lot of motion. There's a lot of things that quarterbacks need to understand and do at the line of scrimmage pre-snap. With a lot of things that they need to read post-snap. If Jalen Milroe can't do that at the level that they want them to do, there's a guy named Ty Simpson who's just kind of lurking there at quarterback too, decided not to leave through the portal. Really, none of the quarterbacks decided to leave through the portal after the spring season, which we all thought was a little surprising, but, maybe speaks to the staff a little bit and kind of what they're asking these guys or maybe what they're telling them specifically. So, on one hand, Jalen Milroe could take big jumps, right? Like this could be the dream season for him. This could be everything that kind of catapults him into potentially a pro career. On the other end, if he doesn't do what's asked of him, Ty Simpson looked pretty good on A-Day, man. Like he just looked comfortable in the system. I know he was playing Alabama's backup, so take it for what it's worth. But, it wouldn't surprise us at all to see Deboer maybe lean into that or make a change if Milroe isn't doing what he's asking. That position's really interesting coming up this fall.
And of course, who you're throwing to matters as well. I mean, you had a first round pick, a top 40 pick, and a top 60 pick at receiver last year. I thought Jalen Polk was really pretty underrated. He ends up going like mid-second round. Do they have the guys at receiver to run what Deboer would prefer to run, but like what we've seen him run very recently at Fresno and also at Washington? Fresno team was kind of sneaky look. I mean, Jake Haener, Jalen Cropper, like they had several dudes on that team who were NFL receivers as well, even at Fresno. What does Bama look like at receiver? Because they lost their top 3 guys.
Yeah, they don't necessarily have like that big body X receiver. Not that they've needed a dude like that the last few years, but it's nice to have it, right? Like they don't have a Rome Odunze, right? There's just not a Rome Odunze on this roster. As for who could potentially fill that role, we like Jeremy Bernard a little bit. Like he came in from Washington. We got to see him through the spring. We got to see him on A-Day. Real explosive receiver. He also knows the playbook, so he's kind of just de facto the leader in that receiver room. Past him, man, like it's a lot of dudes, and we just don't know how they're going to be used, right? So who could have potentially been that X, that Rome Odunze type receiver? We were really high on this guy, Jalen Hale, who, tore up his knee this spring. It's bad enough to where he's probably going to miss most of the season. I think Deboer said that, maybe if they make a playoff run, like, make it to the quarterfinal round this year, maybe potentially he comes back. We're not banking on it. So, he played a lot as a true freshman last year for Saban and Tommy Rees, but, past him, there's, they got 5-star receiver Ryan Williams coming in. A lot of people are really excited about him. I'm a little nervous about his size. He's way closer to Devonta Smith than he is, an Amari Cooper or Julio Jones, right?
And he's 17 years old.
Yeah, very young. So
and not about to, when he doesn't turn 18 until deep into the season?
Yeah, he reclassified. So, tremendous talent, like one of the best prep athletes that, the state of Alabama has ever seen. He's from Saraland, but, does it translate? How does Deboer use him? Is it one of those things where you just kind of, move him around and get him in space, or do you put him at the X and have him run deep down the field? Be kind of curious to see how that works. You've also got some other dudes in the room like Kobe Prentice. He can kind of slide into that slot role now that Isaiah Bond's gone to Texas. Kendrick Laws, kind of similar to Jeremy Bernard in terms of build. Jaron Hamilton's another guy who played a little bit as a freshman. So they've got a lot of dudes. There's talent in that room, right? We're talking about Alabama here, but how they're going to be used, what roles they're going to be, that's something we're really going to be paying attention to, through this summer and especially into fall camp.
You mentioned the X receiver position, sort of that bigger body. That was a position in the portal that was uniquely barren. I know a lot of schools out there were like, kind of need a receiver, but we don't need a slot. Like we don't know what. Like we really need an X, and they couldn't find one, so they just kind of didn't take anybody, or had to kind of settle. But obviously, if you're Alabama and you feel pretty good about your slot, and you're sort of more undersized speed guys, you don't want to crowd the room by taking another guy.
Yeah, well,
he's not an X.
And we were talking about, the impact of coaches being here and not being here earlier, right? With Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff. Jamarcus Shepard's here, right? And he was integral in the, growth and development of Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan. So I think that, the receivers, the guys in the room that we were able to talk to this spring, they're excited about that. Jamarcus Shepard specifically, he's excited about the guys that are in the room. He's excited about adding Williams. So no lack for excitement. There's always excitement when there's new going on, right? So we'll see what he's able to do with this crop of receivers. There's talent there, but how they're going to be used, that's the unknown.
I've always really thought Jamarcus Shepard did a great job. Even when he was at Purdue, and Purdue's a really hard spot to recruit to. I mean, he would land guys. He landed Deion Burks, right? Who's now probably maybe was the best receiver in the transfer portal, and is probably going to be like the number one guy, or at worst, like a 1B at Oklahoma. So I'm excited to see what he can do there for Bama. As a Florida State guy, I got to tell you, Florida State loves Rodell Williams. So that probably speaks to the quality of backfield that Alabama has coming back, that, Rodell Williams hit the portal like that. And Bama doesn't seem to be missing him. What do they have there that has them so excited?
You could argue that running backs is probably the best position on the team, especially on the offense, which is funny because there's not a lot of returning production there. You start with Justice Haynes, right? Former 5-star guy out of Georgia. You've also got Jam Miller there. So they're kind of, A, B, 1, 2. Jam Miller played a little bit last year. He had that, wheel route touchdown against Georgia in the SEC championship game. And then behind them, you've got Richard Young, who's a guy that could start for a lot of programs across the country. So, 3 guys right there who have played a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit. And then behind them, really good depth, right? Former 4-star guy, Daniel Hill, who, I jokingly refer to him as Daniel Mountain, right? Because he's like 6'3", 230. Like the dude's huge. And then you got a local boy, Kevin Riley, coming in, 4-star guy that they flipped from Miami. So it's a good room. It's a deep room. And it's the strength of the offense, and shout out to, Robert Gillespie too. Like he's the running backs coach, one of the holdovers from Saban's last staff. Cause after Saban leaves, there's a huge portal exodus. None of the running backs left, right? I know Roydell Williams left, but he left before, Saban ultimately retired. So they like this room, man. There's a lot of talent in this room. There's not a lot of returning production in this room. Like, I don't think there's a single start in this running back room coming back from last year or previous years. So be interesting to see what they do. Deboer really likes the room, and I think this could be the unit that they maybe lean on a little bit while they figure out, the quarterback and the passing game and things of that nature.
Switching to the defense side of the ball, they go and get Womack from South Alabama, who I think a lot of people in the sport have a lot of respect for. I look at this depth chart, I'm like, okay, so you lost 2 premier pass rushers in Turner and Braswell, and you lost 2 really good corners in Kool-Aid McKinstry, and then Terrion Arnold, who, if you watch the draft broadcast, like Nick Saban just could not shut up like about all the good things about Terrion Arnold as far as like a leader and how he kind of kept the defense together and whatnot. Which of those positions are you more confident that they can replace without a drop-off?
I'm a little bit more confident comparing those two in the cornerbacks. They've got 3 5-star guys. They were able to keep all 3 5-star guys from the holdover, right? Zay Mincy, Zabian Brown, Jalen Mbakwe. Zabian Brown specifically was a guy that impressed all the way through spring. He was running with the ones, wire to wire pretty much with the defense. Jalen Mbakwe is a guy that we've been watching, similar to Ryan Williams, like one of the state of Alabama's best athletes that we've seen in quite a long time. He's a guy that, get him on the field and get him the ball. If not at cornerback, maybe he can return punts or kicks or something like that. One of those things. So longer term, I liked the youth and the depth and the talent that they have at cornerback. But again, you're talking about inexperience too, right? And You mentioned Kane Womack coming in, like similar but different defense to what Saban ran. So excellent that they were able to keep all these young, talented guys, but they're probably going to be asked to do some different things than maybe what Saban was going to ask them. So it's going to be really intriguing, one, to kind of see how the secondary comes together, and two, how do they play? Like, it's not going to be that pattern match man type defense. It's going to be a lot more, zone. Let's keep these guys in front of us and, not give up the big plays. So be interesting to see. But in terms of being able to replace what they lost there, I think I would pick the cornerbacks over the outside linebackers because, those edge rushers, talented, but we got a lot of questions about that group.
Fair enough. So, I mean, growing up in the sport, it seemed like Bama always had like a legitimate game wrecker on the interior defensive line. And I don't know that for the past few years they've necessarily had that. Like, they've had some good players, but they didn't have like a Jalen Carter. They didn't have like the two kids Texas had this past year. Is there anybody on this roster you can see like taking that next step? Like, okay, like that guy's a problem that opposing teams have to game plan for, week in, week out.
I'll give you two names that I think maybe you could keep an eye on. One of them is an interior guy, Tim Keenan. He was a guy that really blossomed last year, was great from the defensive tackle spot, right? Like, he could rush the passer, he could stop the run. A little bit of a revelation because he had kind of been toiling on the bench for the last couple of years. He's really good. Birmingham native. We know the string of Birmingham guys that have come through Alabama and eventually gone on and done really well in the league. Another guy I think to keep an eye on, Jamarian Latham. More of a defensive end. He's a guy that's flashed in small spurts here the last few years, but the way Womack kind of sets up his defense, he's got, his defensive tackles over here and then, his bandit defensive end, right? So that's kind of where Latham's going to be. Him, LT Overton, that's where Keon Keeley has switched to, from edge rusher to now more hand in the dirt type defensive end. I think Jamarian Latham could be in for a pretty big year. I don't know if he can be that consistent game wrecker, but he's got enough talent there to where I think he could really impact a lot of plays down the stretch. And, just looking at Alabama's defensive line, there's a lot of good depth here at virtually all the positions. So come fourth quarter, right, still got a lot of energy, still able to get after the pass rusher, still able to stop the run a little bit. Like, there's a lot of good things that I think could come out of this defensive line, but I like Tim Keenan and Jamarian Latham as kind of the dark horse guys to be the game wreckers for Alabama this year.
Is there a position that you're like, Bud, you haven't asked me about this? You have to, like, if you're talking Bama, you have to ask me about this. I feel like we've covered a lot, but like in your head is like, did I miss something here?
The lack of an edge rusher is going to be different for people who have been watching Alabama for the last 17 years, right? Because they've, and especially recently, right? Like you mentioned, Turner and Braswell, Will Anderson, Drew Sanders for a year. We don't know who that guy's going to be this year, man. Like they've got names there and they've got talent in that room. Because again, talking about Alabama here, but Quandarius Robinson, Keanu Cott, Yonze Pierre, who like Keeley was a, ballyhooed recruit. Quay Rousseau is maybe one of the most pound for pound gifted athletes on the team. We just haven't seen these guys play yet, right? And to be fair, like Cott's been behind, Turner, Braswell, Will Anderson, Quandarius Robinson, same thing, right? He's a fourth-year guy. Pierre and Rousseau both redshirted last year. So not a ton of opportunities. And I think I was telling you here before we hit record too, like, throw Keon Keeley in that mix too. Why didn't we see all these young guys last year? Well, Alabama didn't really blow out a lot of teams last year, right? And one of the things that has really helped that dynasty chug along is, they'd be up 35, 42 points going into the fourth quarter. And a lot of these young guys would be able to see a series or two or three in the fourth quarter, and they'd be able to get that experience. So then the next year they could step in and do the job. We didn't get to see a lot of that last year because Alabama kind of had to muscle through a lot of wins close, late, so what's this outside linebacker role going to look like? Who's the dude going to be? How is it going to be different from, in Kane Womack's defense versus Nick Saban's defense, right? Nick Saban all about getting pressure on the quarterback. Kane Womack more about, limiting big plays, right? More of a swarm type defense. What's going to be asked of these guys? What's their role going to be? There's a lot of questions here that we just don't have the answers to yet because we just haven't seen it with this group of guys, right? We can go back and watch South Alabama film all day. We can go back and watch 2019 Indiana all day, but what's it going to look like with this group of guys? We just don't know yet. Like, that's just kind of one of those wait and see modes.
I sort of love this schedule for Alabama in a way. I mean, West Kentucky, USF, Wisconsin, Bama will be favored in all those games, like massively favored probably in the first two. Then they get a bye before Georgia comes to Tuscaloosa. Whether or not that goes well, you get a great like 2-week reset type situation with a road game at Vandy, which I mean that's kind of like a gift typically for an SEC team, and then South Carolina comes to Tuscaloosa. I mean, then at Tennessee, Missouri is tough. Another bye at LSU. Then you get Mercer at home, at Oklahoma, Auburn. So that's different to have to play like a real game before Auburn. A lot of times you get the SEC SoCon Challenge Week, but that appears to have gone away, maybe at the behest of ESPN. But I don't see Texas on the schedule. And depending on who you look at, Ole Miss is probably somewhere between like the third and fifth best team in the league this year, right? I don't see Ole Miss on the schedule. Like this is a pretty friendly conference draw, I would say, for Kalen Deboer. I mean, you'd like to miss Georgia, but I think you take Georgia if it means you're missing Ole Miss and you're missing Texas as well. I kind of like this for them. And there's some like get right and sort of regroup opportunities too, where you don't have a crazy stretch, I guess.
You look at, who are the big SEC heavy hitters, right, going into next year that at least we maybe know more about than others. Georgia, right? They get them at home. Missouri, I know they're losing Cody Schrader, but that's still, they got a lot of talent on that roster coming in. They get them at home. They still have to go to Tennessee. They still have to go to LSU. They have to go to Oklahoma, right? So those are going to be tough games. But like, you could argue that the heaviest hitters, as we know them right now in late May, they get them at Bryant-Denny Stadium. That's nice, right? And then some of these other teams, you look at DeBoer's track record, they may start a little slower, right? Just trying to figure some things out. But then as soon as they figure out who they are, that's when they take flight, right? So Tennessee, third Saturday in October, at Oklahoma in late November, right? Like ideally, this Alabama team's going to know who they are, what their strengths are, and they're just going to spam that over and over again. So they're going to, I'm not saying that they're going to win those games, but they should feel pretty comfortable about who they are, what they can do, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, that type of thing. And so, yeah, I like the way this schedule sets up. I think an easy, floor to kind of keep the fans happy is probably 9 wins, right? Just because it's the SEC, it's DeBoer's first year. Alabama, while still very talented, did lose a lot of talent. So, how do they, what's it look like first year with a 16-team SEC? I think 9 wins, not only is that the floor to maybe keep the fans happy, very doable when you look at this schedule. Like 9-3 should absolutely do. I don't know if that'll be enough to get into the playoff. That's maybe a separate conversation, but 9-3, doable with this schedule.
I think because Alabama did schedule a real non-conference game, like at Wisconsin is not it's a game you'll be favored to win, expected to win, but it's not a layup. I mean, you can't roll in there with your like D-. You can't pull the USF last year and expect to win that one. Like that'll get you beat. But I think 9-3, because you have Wisconsin on the schedule, is probably likely to get Alabama into the playoff. I mean, I don't think it's a lock. 10-2 is probably a lock at that point. No, I'm excited to watch this team, man. I'm really excited to watch and read all of your coverage at Bama 247. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, man. Alabama's always intriguing and interesting. And then you factor in, new coach, a little bit of roster turnover, all the more reason that Alabama is going to be so intriguing coming up in 2024. It's going to be a fun fall, man.
Cody, I really appreciate the time.
Appreciate you having me, bud.
Yes, sir.